with you, I'm going to do a formal podcast intro now, which is where the recording will start. And I'll introduce myself and then I'll have you introduce yourself.
Sounds great.
Hello, everyone. We're here with the Diversibility Amplified podcast. My name is Erin Tatum. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a white woman with glasses and brunette hair. And today on the podcast, we're lucky enough to be with David Younger. David, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Younger. Um, let's see, I'm a 49-year-old male, and I'm a psychologist and live in Austin, Texas with my family. And I have a type of muscular dystrophy called fascioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, which I was born with. And my mother had it, my grandmother, my great grandfather. And it is a degenerative, progressive condition that affects the skeletal muscles in most of my body.
And David, I know a lot of your work centers around navigating grief and loss as well as parenting with a disability. Did you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I think what's closest to my heart right now, and what feels the most important to me is the piece about navigating loss and grief, and and working in with the shadow. I'm working with the shadow and with what's unconscious, both in terms of my work with individuals in my practice, but also in terms of the impact on ableism and internalized ableism. Um, so basically, I think there's so much work that's being done that's top down on changing behaviors, changing language, changing policy, which is incredibly important, uh, and addressing microaggressions and things, things that Tiffany talks about in the manifesto. And that's the kind of, that kind of disability rights advocacy work is extremely important. And I come at it from a different perspective and focus, which is what what is perpetuating the ableism to begin with? What are we internalizing, and what is keeping people um, sort of functioning in this way where we feel so isolated and marginalized? Why that's happening. um, and I think that we pose an existential threat to people. I think people ultimately are terrified of their own mortality, and I think people are terrified of their bodies breaking down. And the thing about having, and I'm globalizing, I'm generalizing right now, but the thing about having a disability is that anyone can join this club at any time. And that's what makes us and our, specific ism kind of quite unique. If compare it to, say, LGBTQ or, Black and Brown individuals, it's that, it's something that anyone can join at any time. And it's not a club that people want to join. And I think people are, I tell me if I'm going on for too long, but um, I think people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. I think there's an element around that. So, I was just in Seattle for a weekend visiting friends, and my friend, who's not disabled, was noticing how people reacted to me in my wheelchair. And he's like, wow, people are so deferential. And I think there's again, I'm generalizing, but I think there's this fear of saying and doing the wrong thing that can really create the distancing. It can create distance. So there's that. And then there's the, we can only know what we're conscious of. I think there's so much unconscious fear that perpetuates ableism. And it's something that we end up sitting with and internalizing in a deep, sort of undigested way.
And first of all, thank you for being vulnerable enough to share your lived experience with us. And I think of what you said will resonate with the experience of disability and ableism with a lot of our listeners, which is, like you said, people don't like to think about it, but the only thing separating any given person from disability is time. It's the one minority that you could join at any point in your life. So no matter how long you've been able-bodied, or what kind of luck you think you have, or what kind of family history or what kind of health, you could still join at any time just based on random circumstance. And I feel I'm going through that right now as well, personally, because I have cerebral palsy. But my mom has been my caregiver my whole life, and this past May she was diagnosed with ALS, so it just goes to show that anyone can become disabled at any time, and it doesn't matter your proximity or lack of proximity to the community or what kind of background that you have. Disability is kind of the great morbid equalizer that no one wants to think about.
100%. Yeah. I'm I'm really sorry to hear that about your mom.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely been a different experience of disability because cerebral palsy is not degenerative. I've never really had to relate to disability personally in that way. Um, but since ALS is obviously very degenerative and very fast, it's definitely a different way of conceptualizing disability than I've had before in my previous 34 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying, I think, is also so important. It's like we're talking about disability as though my experience with disability is the same as your experience with disability, as the same as your mother's experience with disability. And obviously, they're not. And I think I would be a completely different person if, for example, I discovered I have this condition when I'm a kid, and it's static. It's not, it's not progressive, because then you adapt. You can get used to. But I've constantly had, and this is not a comparing thing. It's more just pointing out, that everyone's subjective experience and lived experience, even with the same condition, is so unique and different. And for me, one of the biggest challenges that I've had is navigating loss, getting used to a new plateau. Like, oh, now I can't do X, Y, and Z. And then you get used to it and you learn to adapt. And then there's more loss. And then you have to get used to more loss. And um, I feel like that's the part of it that, creates just more desperation, because it's like, at some point in your lived experience, you're like, well, there's going to be even more loss. And what am I going to lose next? And that's, to me, it's one of the hardest things about living with my disability.
So, would you say that it's difficult for you to appreciate the moment because you're always kind of experiencing that sort of anticipatory grief of the next loss?
Mm. Sometimes it really, that's a great question. And I think it really depends. And um, I'm very into mindfulness and meditation. I trained and as a teacher as well. It's integrated as part of my personal practice and the way that I work with people. So when I'm doing well and I'm able to be present and right here, knowing that the only moment that there ever is this exact moment right now. And if I can live in this exact moment right now, I'm okay. Then I feel like I'm doing well. When I'm waking up at 3 in the morning with just existential anguish, like, when am I not going to be able to get up from my chair, and I'm going to need to the support, like I won't be able to, I already need help showering. Um, but it's like, when am I going to lose that ability, which is going to require even more caretaking and more money and less independence and, less. I'm a very private person. Like, I'm an introvert. I'm a private person. Uh, I so I wouldn't be choosing to have the kind of help that I need. And I'm grateful that I have the help that I need. So it's not, I guess, to answer your question, it's not a static thing, it's dynamic. Like right now in this very moment, I'm not feeling desperate. I'm not feeling anguish. That doesn't mean that at 3 in the morning, I'm not going to wake up with, this kind of anguish. And it's like about like finding this balance and this equanimity, which is a moving target, as opposed to reaching a finite point where it's like, okay, I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know that point doesn't exist for me.
That's so true because I feel like part of what people assume adapting to disability is just reconciling yourself to your new reality. And I feel like what non-disabled people think it is kind of accepting that your reality as a disabled person will never be as good as when you weren't disabled. But I feel like people fail to account with progressive things, is that it's not just a mindset and how positive or cynical you are. It's a day by day, hour by hour adjustment. And every day can be different.
Exactly. Every day can be different. And um, yeah, it's not static. And we're also dealing with, again, so much that's imposed upon us. We're dealing with environmental restrictions and limitations, and again, feeling marginalized. And I don't think, I mean, part of the struggle too is that I think for the most part, if I'm going to generalize, people have good intentions. They don't want to marginalize us, but it's also, how much are people really making the effort to see their reflection in us as opposed to see someone who's an other. This is not going to happen to me. I would never want to live this way. Poor you. All of these, things where in all of those statements and those beliefs is implicit in that is an othering, like, this will not and cannot happen to me, which we know is a fallacy. And you're living that with your mother right now.
And and I think that people believe that if they just don't look at us enough, or if they just refuse to interact with us enough, or refuse to humanize us, they can keep us compartmentalized away in this little box of tragedy that will never touch them or anyone that they know or love. And I would definitely say my mom is probably going through that to a certain degree because her whole life since I've been born, she's been the caregiver. So people looked at her tragedy, which is kind of an extension of me. And now that disability is sort of approaching my family on a new axis, I tell people and they're like, well, what do you mean your mom is going to be disabled too now? Like, I thought you were the disabled one.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's silly because it's like, but I admit, I never really conceptualized of this level of tragedy because I thought I was the tragic one. So, it just goes to show that disability is always surprising you in the worst ways possible.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
It's like we're Medusa too. It's like another way to put it is like, yeah, if you look too hard, you'll turn into stone. If you look too closely, then what's going to happen, what's going to come up for you, what's going to be exposed. So the easiest thing to do is look the other way.
Yeah, exactly. And in that respect too, it's certainly a self-fulfilling prophecy because the more people are compelled to look away from us in daily instances, literally not make eye contact with us, but more broadly and on an institutional level to not acknowledge us in policy or to not acknowledge us in public station, the more that perpetuates the continued degradation of what little humanity we have.
Yeah. I mean, I was just dealing with that in looking. So when I went to Seattle, it was the first time I've traveled in almost 5 years. And I founded a travel agent who specializes in working with accessibility, and wanted to like rent an adjustable bed for my hotel room, um a rollator and a recliner chair, a lift recliner chair. And so I started looking at hotels, and it's amazing. Most hotels, just off the bat, they're like, no, sorry, we can't accommodate you. And it's not that they can't, they're not willing to. They're not, and what they have to do in order to accommodate me, literally, is say, okay, we'll move one or two pieces of furniture out of the room to make space for the furniture that you need in order to stay in our hotel. All these hotels have storage spaces. Um, Finally, I find a hotel that was willing to do that. Literally, all they had to do was move one small desk out of the corner and rearrange some of the furniture in order to accommodate. But the lack of willingness and the lack of awareness, like, no, we're not willing to make that accommodation for you. How are you not going to internalize that? I mean, in terms of, well, what does that mean? Like, I don't live in a world that's, willing to say, oh, this is what we need to do in order to give you a level playing field, to stay in a freaking hotel, to sleep a night at a hotel.
Yeah, and also keep in mind you're paying them and they're still not willing to move the furniture. It's not like they're doing you a favor or letting you stay for free.
Or yeah, can you please pay for the medical equipment that I need in order to be able to stay in your hotel? No, I'm paying for it myself.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I truly do feel like that people think that disability is automatically like an inconvenience tax. And it's like, well, if it's inconvenient for you in this experience, imagine how inconvenient it is for us to live through it.
Yeah. I mean, another example of that is going to restaurants and finding a table that doesn't have a center post. So essentially you can't fit your wheelchair under the table because there's a center post. Uh, how many restaurants have how hard would it be to have one table with four corner posts, that the table you can fit your wheelchair under, for a restaurant to have just one of those tables that so that you can go and eat with dignity? How hard would that be? But how often do you see that?
That reminds me of this past summer. I was at my friend's bachelorette, and we had a very late reservation at a really fancy restaurant. And we had to wait probably about an extra 30 minutes because they didn't know where they were going to put my chair, even though we told them ahead of time that I was in it. Like, it's so silly, and so many of the things to accommodate us moving through the real world are just common sense, and yet people still can't do it.
Yeah. Which is why, like, it's so valuable. The people who are doing the work, the policy work, the awareness work, um, is so valuable. And again, in terms of my interest in my writing and my work and talking about it, navigating loss and grief, it's like for me, I'm focusing about what are the consequences of internalizing all of this, in terms of the shame, in terms of the self hatred, in terms of the isolation, the depression, the loneliness, the marginalization, the distorted views that we have of ourselves, that as an inevitable consequence of internalizing all of this undigested, undigestible material. That's where what I'm interested in focusing on.
Yeah, and I would hope that eventually most people would come to realize, as I have, that the more you cater to an ableist mindset and the more you try to fit yourself into a perpetually smaller and more cramped corner, you're not actually helping yourself rise above ableism. You're just dragging everybody else down with you in your own enabling of society's disrespect of you.
Absolutely. And not only that, you're perpetuating the illusion that you're immortal. You're perpetuating the illusion that you don't live in a body that is going to age and fail you in some way. How is that helpful? So we're living, in this global illusion that we're going to live forever in healthy bodies. And that is something that is going to crash down for every single person who's laboring under that illusion. And that's not helpful.
And I don't know how in online spaces you are, but even with the younger people, I've noticed it a lot with Gen Z too, where it's not even direct ableism, but the interplay between ageism and ableism as well, because it seems like everyone in their 20s thinks that you turn into a bag of bones the second you hit 30, and it's like, no, we also need to conceive of aging itself in healthy ways so that we can make peace with our body and not just all wander around thinking that, like, oh, there's no point in living socially after I turn 27 or whatever age you've internalized.
Yeah. No, there's so much overlap there, and so much overlap also in terms of how segregated the elderly are, shipping them off to homes. It's like again, it's another group of people, like, we cannot look at you because you make me think about my own mortality.
Right, and it's essentially at the baseline, it's I find you kind of gross and sad, so therefore get out of my sight. And it's like all people need to come to the point that they're not going to be like at their physical prime every single day of their life for 50 years and drop dead. Like, some increment of aging is going to tap into everyone, even if you don't become disabled. So part of aging involves, as you were saying, like that bodily disconnect and that bodily breakdown. So we also need to come up with softer and more emotional reactions than I don't want to look at you because it reminds me that I'm going to die.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what we're up against, I think, in terms of dealing with the shadows of ableism. Is we're up against a collective avoidance of mortality and aging and our bodies falling apart. Like, that's the existential threat that we're up against, which is couldn't be bigger, right?
I I know, because it's like, how do you tackle something that has such a vice grip on all of society, and especially the younger people in society who are typically associated with being the biggest engine for change?
Exactly.
Yeah, so if they're not motivated and they're against you, how are you supposed to sort of massage that compassion into the ideology of older generations and more stereotypically rigid demographics of people?
Yeah, that's that's the challenge that we're up against.
And I feel like people say that social media contributes to a degree, which I definitely agree with, in perpetuating the illusion that everybody has to stay 23 forever. But also, I feel as though people just need to interact with people in their real lives to be more emotionally attuned with even what people in their own families are going through. Like, I don't know if you've experienced this, but my extended family kind of knows I'm disabled, but that's it. Like, they've never really. I mean, and I'm not saying that they're obligated to, but they've never really interacted with me or sort of helped my parents with the experience at all because it's conceptualized as a singular tragedy.
Yes, I feel like part of the thing that's been cathartic for me about my writing, because I've been very open and vulnerable about my lived experience. And some of the people who are reading my writing are family and friends who are learning things about me that they've never known. Because even with people who are invested in you, who you have a relationship with, there are still these barriers, right? And there's still this sort of two-dimensional, you live with a disability, but like you said, there's not this going beyond that into, the third dimension of it. Let me touch you and understand your lived experience, your subjective experience, and connect with you in that way, which again can feel so isolating. And for me, for so many years, it was like, well, people don't really want to know that. So I just have to keep it inside and make other people feel comfortable around me, which is so toxic. And it's just like you want to write a recipe for depression. That's a recipe for depression, which I've had plenty of experience, years of clinical depression. And I'm not depressed now. And I think it's, even though I'm physically more affected than I've ever been, the reason I'm not depressed now is because I'm expressing myself more, and I'm not managing other people's consumption of my experience anymore. If you're uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable. It's not my job to make you feel comfortable.
Right, and I would also say that it's not your job to manage people's expectations or reactions to you or your diagnosis or what you go through on a daily basis, because I also feel as people with disabilities who often need to interact so much more intimately with multiple people as opposed to other people who might just be interacting with an intimate partner or or what have you. We have to sort of manage like a galaxy of feelings and emotions of all these people who are around us and have to interact with us. But when you metaphorically step back and think about it, it's not really our job to do that, and we can only be responsible for our own emotions and reactions.
Yeah, think about like how exhausting that is to think, to feel like you do have to manage, and not just manage, like digest and help people process all around you. How would that not just be totally, obliterating, exhausting? And again, it's like, a recipe for depression.
Yeah, and I know you've spoken a lot about your experiences with clinical depression, but overall, how would you say um, your disability has influenced your mental health and vice versa? And how do you sort of balance or acknowledge those two things simultaneously?
Mm. Um, yeah, so I mean, ever since sort of starting college, uh, I dealt with depression. Um, and so for me personally, the first 25 years of my life, if I had to sort of uh, distill it into how I related with my disability, I didn't talk about it. My mother, I witnessed my mother, who had the same type of muscular dystrophy, getting worse and worse and living with chronic pain. I didn't talk with my parents about it. I didn't tell my teachers about it. I hid it from myself and from everyone around me. And what came from that? A tremendous amount of shame. Um, then, starting in college, I started sharing with some of my closest friends and a kind of coming out of the closet with living with a disability. And I went into a new stage of a desperate search for treatments because there still is, there are experimental things happening, but there's no treatment or cure. So literally traveling the world, like spending time in southern India with a doctor in southern India, going to Thailand, going to Sri Lanka, going to San Francisco, searching desperately for how do I stop this ticking time bomb that's happening in my body. And again, a lot of depression because there was so much fear and anxiety. And I started going to therapy in my early 20s. And I'm still in therapy. I'm in individual therapy. We do couples therapy, my wife and I. I'm in group therapy. And I have a meditation practice, but it's only in the past decade that, and I'm 49, that I've moved into a place of more and more acceptance and being with, making space for the grief, the loss, the pain, all this stuff that has been unprocessed and internalized that and compartmentalized that I just never made space for. And that's what's been the most healing for me, is softening to my experience and the challenges and the loss and the grief and the pain and the different iterations of who I was and my struggles, and having compassion for the younger version of myself that felt like I needed to hide this from myself and the world, as opposed to judging him and approaching him with a more punitive lens, which I've done as well. So it's really self compassion, like genuine self compassion, um, that has made me feel more open, more accessible to my own experience, more accessible to my vulnerability, and a desire to put myself out there more, like with the writing and with the work I'm doing now, with our conversation. Like, I wouldn't have had this conversation with you and had the opportunity to sit here and connect with you the way that we are 10, 15 years ago. It would have been too threatening for me. So being able to talk, like, I have a desire to talk about my my lived experience because it's cathartic and therapeutic for me, but also because I genuinely want to normalize it and help other people feel less alone, because I know that we all have our subjective experiences which are different, but there are also so many shared experiences we have living with, a disability, a chronic illness, terminal illness, whatever it is.
Right, and I think the more, first of all, thank you for sharing that to me with me, and it's very humbling to hear how far you've progressed, even within the past 10 or 15 years, because I know shame to pride pipeline can be a very difficult road for many people with disabilities. So the fact that I think now you kind of see more on the other side of it is remarkable, especially in the stew of ableism that we're steeped in every single day. But I also think that once people realize they have more in common with us than they think, and chronic illness and disability isn't something to be feared, that's when I think the gateway to that level of connection will really be fully opened up.
Yeah, 100%. The question is, uh, again, I mean, we talked earlier about the barriers to that gateway. How optimistic are you about those barriers or that gateway being opened up? What do you agree that, like, to me, I think like the biggest gate that's in the way is the existential threat that disability and poses. How do you feel about that?
I agree, and I think that I have the luxury of kind of being a millennial who witnesses Gen Z a lot, and I'm very encouraged by Gen Z's openness and the way they kind of interact with disability. It gives me a lot of hope for the future, but at the same time, and I know our lived experience are totally different, but I've lived in this body for 34 years. You could argue I've had consciousness for maybe about 30 of them, and simultaneously through that experience, people's reactions and prejudices and biases have been more or less the same, with minimal cresting throughout different phases of my life. So even though the optimist in me wants to be very positive, I think, like, what can a small group of people do against the existential dread that humanity has against death, if that's the linchpin in our collective dehumanization? Like, it just seems like a really steep uphill battle, and even though I'm excited by the amount of progressive voices that we have, and certainly the variety and depth of those perspective voices, I still know that humans are humans and we all have the same tendencies and vices at the end of the day. So I do have moments where I lay awake at night and I think, how far can we really get if what we're up against is like a central tenet of human psychology for all of our billions of years of existence?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's such an eloquent way of putting it. I completely agree.
To put it more simply, I want to believe in my own power and your own power and all of our power collectively, but I just know people, and I know non-disabled people, and frankly, way less eloquently. They're kind of shitty, and everybody has a tendency to, like, be kind of a jerk. So, like, how do you counterbalance that on a society-wide scale?
Exactly. And also, it's interesting, like I co-started, co-led a mental health and wellness group online for people with the same kind of muscular dystrophy that I have. And I think I was pretty naive, like hoping and expecting that all the people who were going to join were going to want to kind of dive into the depths with me and really explore these issues. And it was incredible how much resistance there was. People didn't want to go there. They just wanted to skim the surface and to have more just small talk and connection, which is valuable and beautiful. But the explicit purpose of this group was mental health and wellness. And yes, connection and community, obviously, there are integral components and parts of mental health and wellness. But it was really discouraging. It doesn't, just because you even have the same condition and you literally have, you can generalize a lot of the physical challenges even amongst that community, you cannot generalize what one's internal lived experience is.
And I also think trying to empathize more with their experience and their perspective. It's like, if you're already struggling in a river, are you gonna opt to go in a space and tie rocks to your feet? Like, no. Because if the point is you're already struggling, I guess maybe what they were thinking of was more like being emotionally buoyed by the comfort of community of people who at least share a surface level diagnosis. And I feel like a lot of times too, when you're disabled, you internalize the idea that if you just don't think about it, or if you just don't make a big deal out of it to other people, then your day will be better than it would have been otherwise. So I think it's a shame, because I do think people are kind of discouraged and shamed away from acknowledging those deeper feelings and the more fraught crises of consciousness that they're experiencing.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, and that also speaks to what you said before, which is, even when you have the exact same diagnosis, everyone's experience of every single day is completely different.
Yeah.
So, in that way, having a disability can feel very isolating, because even when you're in a community of people who are exactly quote unquote like you can still feel worlds apart in
Yeah.
terms of what you're feeling and interpreting and processing every day.
Yeah, that's the way I felt after a year of leading this group. I felt discouraged. I felt more isolated. And your perspective, that is, it's true. It's like, I think people were really appreciating having a place where we've got this shared diagnosis, and can we be together and make jokes and talk about our, day-to-day lives. And there's value in that. And for me, and I think part of it is also being a psychologist, is that I spend so much of my time going deep with people that it's like, you know, having small talk, see, I have an aversion to that. Um, and I do think it's like it's a symptom, and it's of being a therapist, is like you get used to relating in a certain way. And so relating in these other ways doesn't feel very satisfying. And I think being an introvert is that way too. And like, I always sort of have this sort of cost benefit. Like, would I rather be by myself? Would I rather be reading a book, or, doing my writing, or engaged with in this sort of social interaction right now?
And there always seems to be that kind of guilt or internal struggle between, do, do I give myself a break and let myself rest? Or do I engage with the hard psychological work of, my decline and my mortality, or the struggle of perpetuating my daily existence, and how much effort and emotional bandwidth do I really want to give to that before I sink myself into another hole of depression? But on the same side too, you think like, will that benefit the larger community if I share those thoughts?
Yeah.
So it's a struggle.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And I know you do a lot of your work about parenting with the disability as well. Did you want to talk a little bit about the ways that disability intersects with fatherhood, and how your children are kind of interpreting your diagnosis throughout different phases of life?
Yes, that is a big one. So I have two kids. I've got a 21-year-old boy, and I've got an 11-year-old girl, and neither have muscular dystrophy. Um, and our daughter is neurodiverse, so she has a different kind of disability. And the issues I've faced, so it's almost like they've had two different experiences of me, because my son, who's 21, really witnessed my physical decline. He saw me falling and being able to walk to, not being able to walk to starting to use a wheelchair. And then we moved to Austin 10 years ago, and that's when I got my first wheelchair. And I remember very vividly um, going. He had a soccer game, and I showed up at his soccer game in the wheelchair, and it was the first time that I used the wheelchair in public, and he could barely look at me. It was so hard for him because he was trying to integrate himself into this new community and not want. And he was in middle school, and when you're in middle school, it's like you don't want to be different. And he was not only seeing like me in a wheelchair for the first time and how hard that was for him, but it was also being aware of his peers seeing his father in a wheelchair. So it was so hard for me not to internalize that and confirm, you see, this is shameful. You see, like it's not okay to just be me and to be proud of who I am. So there was a lot of that that I had to go through. And um, with my daughter, it's been different. My daughter she's a little too big for it now, but she loved sitting on my lap in the wheelchair and calling it her chariot and saying, when I get married one day, I want you to chariot me down the aisle. So it's been a different lived experience with her. But a big challenge for me is to make space for my kids' development and recognizing that they're going to have their own evolving experience of living with my disability and not internalizing it and using it as a weapon against myself and saying, see, I am defective. See, there is no space for me. So it's really like helped me and pushed me to grow because I want my kids to be able to express themselves regarding my disability. And my son and I have ongoing discussions about it. He'll tell me it's really hard for me to come home and see I feel like every time I come home, there's something new that you're struggling with. And that's really hard for me. It's painful for me. And is that hard for me to hear? Yes. But do I cherish the fact that he feels comfortable enough to come to me and talk about it, as opposed to what it was like when I was his age, not talking about it, not talking about it with my parents, keeping it all inside, that he's able to do that and cry, and that we're able to be real with each other and make space for the vulnerability and the strength that comes with that. Because the amount that I've had to adapt to, the amount like that I have, that I feel in an authentic and humble and, vulnerable forward way is pretty incredible. And I know that my kids see that. And I also know that what I'm not able to do physically, the amount that I am able to do in relationship to my kids and being with them and being a father to them, I I am able to own that 100%. So it is it has been incredibly challenging. I'm trying to sort of encapsulate an incredibly complex and nuanced question into a few minutes of an answer. I hope that I've been able to do that, but there's so much there.
Of of course, I think you've been very thorough, and I definitely think obviously having a disability and it's experiencing its effect, as I know now from personal experience, is very different from being a child of someone with a disability, no matter what the diagnosis is. And I think particularly Well, what you were saying about your daughter resonated with me because that's what I do with my niece and nephew, and that's how they relate to me because, you know, cerebral palsy doesn't really change, so I've been the same since they were born, so they climb all over my chair and make jokes with me all the time. Whereas now that my mom is getting worse and I live with her, it's hard to watch her struggle to do things every day, and I definitely relate to your son's pain on that because I think it's not embarrassment or shame, but it's just you your compassion for them because you know something worse is coming and you don't want your parents to suffer. So I
Yeah,
really relate to that.
yeah, exactly.
Um, is your son a college student?
He is. He's a senior in college.
Oh, lovely. What's he studying?
He's studying East Asian studies like Mandarin and political science.
Ooh, that's an interesting mix of things that will serve him well.
Yeah, yeah. He's a beautiful, sensitive uh young man. He's turning 21 in a couple weeks in November 9th.
Wow, that's incredible. And really, as you kind of shepherded him to adulthood, as you sort of perch upon the precipice of this moment, sort of gaze back upon everything the two of you have been through, what advice would you give to other parents out there who are trying to sort of, guide their kids through the same phases of life that you and your son have gone through together?
What a beautiful question. I would say if I could have sooner, again, this is very much in sort of in brand with the navigating loss and stuff, but is to make space for the vulnerability and to really, when you make space for the vulnerability and realize how much strength it takes to live with the vulnerability as opposed to avoid it, to talk about the things that are difficult to talk about. Because when we don't talk about them, when we compartmentalize, when we avoid them, it's not like they go away. They just grow in the shadows, and they manifest in other ways that are indirect. But you don't we don't get rid of them when we lock them away behind ivory towers. It doesn't work that way. So, really, just being real and talking about the sadness, talking about the pain, talking about making space for the grief. Culturally, we're awful at making space for grief. It's like, all right, you have a week to grieve and then, get on with it and do on to other things. Well, living with a progressive illness, guess what? There's ongoing grief. And I didn't make space for that for so long. And I wish I did. I wish I had the tools to when I was younger. I wish I had people who helped me to be able to do that. So just making space for what is there, and realize that vulnerability is strength. And if you are able to make space for it, to integrate it, your life and your relationship with your kids is going to be so much richer. And in developmentally appropriate ways, you're going to talk about this stuff with a 10-year-old in different ways that you're going to talk about it with a 20-year-old, right? Like there's not just a formula for how do you talk about this? How do you make space for this? But just don't ignore it. Don't, it's such a disservice because there's so much fertile ground here if you make space for it.
And I would also add that the more you ignore grief and trauma in the acid of sort of if if you ignore it in ways that are very callous and in ways that den- deny your soul the opportunity to speak, that trauma gains more sharper and jagged edges over time is what I'm
Yeah.
trying to say, and it will only cut you deeper the next time you encounter it.
Yes.
Um, And to your extent too, I also feel like with death and mortality and different illnesses, people assume that you have to shield children from that, but I also think it's more respectful to your child if you acknowledge that and you explain it to them in age-appropriate ways.
Yes, 100%. How are we perpetuate, like unconsciously and unwittingly, how are we perpetuating the illusion? How are we perpetuating ableism by not addressing that?
Right, because we're teaching our children, or even if we don't have children, we're teaching the next generation that disability is something to be avoided and ignored for as long as possible until it reaches some point of crisis. But that's just horrible for everyone on an emotional coping level.
Yes, 100%.
I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, but was there anything else that you wanted to say before we wrap up the recording?
Just that I've really, really enjoyed talking with you. And I'm so glad I reached out and glad that you made the time and the space to connect. That it feels really rich and meaningful. I know we've covered a lot in this hour, and I'm just grateful uh, to have met you.
Thank you, David. That means a lot to me, especially as someone who recently my experience with disability has felt very new and very disarming and very isolating. So I really feel as though diversibility has presented me with a unique opportunity in the wake of my mom's diagnosis to really reconnect and re-relate with disability in a new way that doesn't have to feel terrifying. So I appreciate you for giving me a safe space to kind of sort of talk about and work through those emotions, or larger philosophical scarecrows, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think we've given that to each other, which feels really beautiful. Thank you.
Of course, and I think so. What I'll do is I'll stop the recording here, and I'll explain to you. So the next steps will be I don't know if you wanted to. What I'll do is I'll write like a little summary of what we talked about, and that'll be in the description, and then I'll post it on Spotify, and we'll promote it on social media. So when the links to everything is live, what I can do is I can email them to you.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, David, I really appreciate it. This was such a profound conversation, and I really feel as though it spoke to both parts of my life, both as a child with a disability and now the parent of someone with a disability. So I would say that at this point in my life, you were probably one of the best and most interesting people that I could have talked to. So I appreciate your perspective and your worldview. It's really comforting and enlightening to me.